He was a farmer, and he was setting out 3 beds. Then the orc looked at him, her voice rough like stones grinding in a riverbed, and said, "If you send us away, we'll have no one." Elian's life had a rhythm, dictated by the sun and the soil. It was a simple, quiet percussion of boot on earth, axe on wood, hand on plow. His farm was a small pocket of order carved from the edge of the glimmerwood, a place of old trees and older silence. The stone house his grandfather had built stood against the wind, its slate roof slick with moss. The fields yielded just enough. The solitude was a blanket he had pulled over himself years ago, and he had forgotten the warmth of anything else. He had come here after the fire, after the screaming, after the accusing eyes of the town council. He had been a guard, sworn to protect. He had failed. The memory was a dull ache in his bones, a constant companion in the long, silent evenings. Here, the only lives he was responsible for were his own and the stubborn crops he coaxed from the rocky soil. It was enough. It had to be. The storm broke that night with the fury of a betrayed god. Rain came down in sheets, turning the path to the door into black sludge. Wind howled through the eaves, a mournful song that made the fire in the hearth gutter and spit. Elian was mending a leather strap for his plow harness, his hands moving with the slow, deliberate surety of long practice. The work was familiar. The storm was familiar. It was the sudden, frantic pounding on his door that was not. He froze, the awl held tight in his fist. No one came to his door. Traders kept to the main road 5 miles south. Trappers knew better than to bother him. He set the strap down, his heart a heavy, uneven drum against his ribs. He took the iron poker from the hearth. It was not a weapon, but it was heavy and solid in his hand. The pounding came again, weaker this time, followed by a heavy slump against the wood. He moved slowly, his boots silent on the stone floor. He lifted the bar, his knuckles white. He expected a wolf, crazed by the storm, or perhaps a lost traveler, half dead from exposure. He did not expect orcs. 3 of them. They spilled into the doorway as he opened it, a tangle of green-gray skin, dark leather, and blood. 2 were barely conscious, leaning on the 3rd, who stood defiant even as she swayed on her feet. She was tall, broader in the shoulder than he was, with black hair plastered to her skull by the rain. A deep, ragged gash wept blood down her side, staining her tunic a dark, glistening crimson. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, found his. They held no plea, only a terrible, exhausted challenge. Behind them, for just a moment before the sheeting rain obscured the view, he saw it. A flicker of torchlight deep in the woods. Then he heard it, faint beneath the wind's shriek. A horn, a hunting call. His mind screamed at him. Bar the door. They were orcs, killers, raiders. Their wars were not his. Their problems were not his. He had built this life on the foundation of minding his own business. To invite this in was to invite the fire back into his life. The poker felt heavy, useless. He could kill the wounded one, perhaps. The other 2 looked ready to collapse. But then what? 3 bodies to bury in the morning. The standing orc watched him, her breath coming in ragged pants. She held a crude, heavy-bladed axe in one hand, but her grip was weak. She saw him looking at the torchlight, at the weapon in his hand. She didn't flinch. It was as if she expected the blow, had been expecting it her whole life. He stepped back, and he said, the word was a croak, torn from a throat tight with fear. She stared at him, suspicion warring with desperation in her gaze. Her 2 companions slid further down, their weight too much for her. One of them, younger, with a raw scrape across her cheek, moaned softly. Elian didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed the arm of the nearest one and hauled her over the threshold. The weight was immense, solid muscle and bone. He grunted with the effort, dragging her clear of the door. He went back for the second. The leader watched him, her face a mask of stone, her eyes tracking his every move. Finally, when her companions were inside, she stumbled forward and collapsed onto the floor. Elian shoved the heavy door shut and dropped the bar into its iron brackets. The sound echoed in the sudden, dripping silence of the room. The storm raged outside. Inside, There was only the sound of the fire, the dripping of water from their clothes, and the harsh, labored breathing of the three intruders. He had just invited the world he had fled from right into his home. He looked at the blood pooling on his floor and felt the old, familiar dread coiling in his gut. He had not asked their names. He did not ask who hunted them. Questions were hooks, and he had no desire to be snagged in their story. He fetched water from the basin, tearing strips from an old linen shirt. He knelt by the leader. She had managed to push herself up to a sitting position, her back against the wall. Her axe lay beside her. Her hand was on its haft. "Don't," she rasped, her voice a low growl. He stopped, the wet cloth in his hand. "That wound will kill you." "Many things will kill me," she said. "A human's knife is as good as any. If I wanted to kill you, I would have left you in the rain for your friends." He gestured vaguely toward the door. She considered this. Her eyes were sharp, analytical. He could see her weighing the odds, calculating the angles of threat. He was a man alone. They were three, even wounded. But this was his home. He knew its secrets. She knew nothing. "What do you want?" she asked. The question was a blade. Elias thought of the quiet rhythm of his life, now shattered. "For you to not die on my floor." It was a poor answer, but it was the only one he had. He held out the cloth. She watched him for a long moment, then gave a short, sharp nod. It was not permission. It was a concession. He worked in silence. The gash in her side was deep, crusted with dirt and pine needles. He cleaned it as gently as he could. She did not hiss or cry out, but he saw the muscles in her jaw bunch into knots of iron. He was used to tending injuries on his livestock, and the work was grimly similar. When it was clean, he took out his suture kit, the one he used for stitching up sheep after a wolf attack. "What is that?" she demanded, her eyes narrowing at the glint of the needle. "It will close the wound." She stared at it, then at him. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not fear, but a deep, ingrained suspicion of anything that wasn't straightforward force. He simply waited. Finally, she looked away, staring into the fire. "Do it." He stitched the wound. His fingers, usually steady, trembled slightly. He was intensely aware of her presence, of the coiled power in her frame, even weakened as she was. He could feel her watching him, feel the weight of her judgment. The other two orcs had stirred, pushing themselves up to watch. Their expressions were hostile, protective. He ignored them, focusing on the task. One stitch, then another, tying the knots just so. When he was done, he bandaged it with more clean linen. He rose, his knees cracking. He moved to the hearth and ladled 3 bowls of the thin vegetable broth he had made for his own supper. He set them on the floor, a safe distance away. "Eat," he said, and retreated to his chair by the fire, turning his back on them. It was the most deliberate act of trust he could offer. He was showing them his spine, giving them the advantage. He picked up the plow harness and the awl, his hands resuming their familiar work. He listened to the sounds behind him, a hesitant scrape of a bowl, a quiet sip, then another. He did not look back. He just worked, the storm howled, and the 3 fugitives ate his food in the precarious sanctuary of his home. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. He rose before dawn, as he always did. The 3 orcs were asleep on the floor where he had left them, huddled together for warmth. He had offered them the spare cots in the loft, but the leader, he had started thinking of her as the leader, had refused with a sharp shake of her head. They would stay on the hard floor, together, where they could defend each other. He moved quietly, stoking the fire, putting a pot of water on to boil for porridge. He stepped outside into the cold, damp air. His fields were soaked but intact. He checked the fence line, his eyes scanning the trees. There were no tracks, no sign of the hunters from the night before. The rain had washed everything away. For now, they were safe. It was a temporary reprieve, a breath held in the face of an inevitable shout. When he returned, they were awake. The leader was checking the bandage on her side. The other 2 were on their feet, looking cramped and hostile in the small room. The younger one, Zora, held a skinning knife. The older one, Gera, simply stood with her arms crossed, her presence a silent warning. He ignored their posturing and spooned porridge into 3 bowls, adding a dollop of honey to each. He set them on the table. "If you're staying, you eat," he said. The leader, whose name he still did not know, met his gaze. "We are not staying. You're not leaving either," he countered, nodding at her side. "Not like that. You wouldn't make it a mile." She didn't argue. She knew he was right. Her pride was a thing of stone, but the facts were facts. She gestured for the other two to eat. They ate standing up, like wolves, their eyes constantly scanning the room. He ate at the table, taking his time, demonstrating a calm he did not feel. The first day passed in a tense, suffocating silence. The orcs stayed in one corner of the main room, speaking to each other in low, guttural tones he did not understand. He went about his chores, acutely aware of their eyes on him. He mucked out the small animal pen, milked his single goat, and worked on repairing a section of fence damaged by the wind. Every time he turned around, one of them seemed to be there, watching from the doorway or the edge of the woods. They were testing his routine, learning his movements. He pretended not to notice. On the second day, something shifted. He was splitting firewood, his axe rising and falling in a steady, metronomic rhythm. It was hard, honest work, and it soothed the unease in his chest. He set a particularly thick, knotted log on the block. As he raised the axe, the younger one, Zora, stepped out of the house. She walked over, took the axe from his unresisting hands, and motioned for him to step aside. He did, surprised. She hefted the axe, testing its weight. Then she swung. The blow was brutally efficient, splitting the stubborn log in a single, clean strike. She tossed the two halves onto the pile and set the next log on the block. She did not speak. She just worked, her movements filled with a coiled energy that was almost frightening. In an hour, she had done what would have taken him half the day. Later, he saw the older one, Gera, sitting by the barn door. She had his whetstone and was sharpening his scythe. Her movements were slow, patient, and precise. She drew the stone along the curved blade again and again, her eyes half closed in concentration. When she was finished, the edge gleamed with a light it hadn't had in years. It looked less like a farm tool and more like a weapon. The leader did not work. She spent most of the day sitting by the fire, resting, her face pale. But he saw her watching the others, a flicker of approval in her eyes. She was letting them help. It was another concession, another small stone laid on the fragile bridge of trust they were building between them. That night, they shared his meal of roasted roots and salted goat meat. The silence was still there, but it was different, less hostile, more thoughtful. He found himself watching the leader. Her name, he learned from a stray word Gera used, was Urka. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if conserving her strength. There was a weight on her, the heavy burden of command. He recognized it. He had seen it in his captain's eyes, back in the town guard. The loneliness of making decisions that other people's lives depended on. He fell asleep in his chair again that night. The day's work and the constant, underlying tension had exhausted him. He woke in the cold, dark hours before dawn. The fire was banked, glowing softly. A rough, woolen blanket was draped over his shoulders. It was not one of his. It smelled of pine, iron, and something else, something uniquely Orcish. He looked over. Urka was sitting in her corner, awake. She was watching the embers, her profile stark and proud in the dim light. She must have seen him stir, but she gave no sign. He didn't say anything. He just pulled the blanket tighter and closed his eyes, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. A week passed. A routine of a sort began to form. He would do his farm work. They would help. Zora's boundless energy was put to use on the most physically demanding tasks. Gera, quiet and observant, seemed to have a knack for mending and reinforcing things, from a broken wheel on his cart to the sagging gate of the animal pen. Urka, her strength slowly returning, took to patrolling the perimeter of the farm, moving like a shadow through the trees, her eyes always scanning the horizon. They spoke little, but in the evenings, by the fire, pieces of their lives began to surface. He learned they were from the Dragon's Tooth Mountains, a harsh, unforgiving land of stone and ice. Urka spoke of it not with fondness, but with a fierce, possessive pride. She described the way the wind could cut a person to the bone, and the taste of snowmelt water, so cold it made your teeth ache. "It is a hard land," she said one night, her voice low. "It makes for hard people." In turn, he found himself speaking of his old life. Not the fire, never the fire, but he told them about the town, the crowded market, the smell of bread from the bakery, the way the river looked at sunset. He spoke of it like a man describing a foreign country. "You left," Garrus stated. "It was not a question." "I had to," he said, and the finality in his voice cut off any further inquiry. But he felt Urka's eyes on him, probing, as if trying to see the shape of the failure he was hiding. She understood running. She understood being forced out. He saw a flicker of kinship in her gaze, and it unsettled him more than her hostility had. The feeling of peace, fragile as it was, could not last. He knew that. It was a truth that sat in the back of his mind, a cold stone in his gut. He found the proof on a gray, overcast morning while checking a line of snares at the edge of his property. It was a spear driven deep into the earth next to a fence post. The shaft was black ash, the head a cruel-looking piece of pitted iron. Tied, just below, was a tattered strip of cloth, dyed black and red. He had seen the sigil before, years ago, on the armor of orc mercenaries. A clan marker, a claim, a threat. They knew. They knew where the quarry was hiding. He pulled the spear from the ground and carried it back to the farmhouse, his hands cold around the rough wood. He didn't need to say anything. When he walked into the clearing, Urka saw the spear in his hand, and her face became a mask of granite. "How many?" she asked. "I don't know. I saw no tracks." "They will send scouts first," Garrus said, her hand going to the hilt of her heavy knife. "To test the defenses." "What defenses?" Elian asked, a dry, humorless laugh escaping him. "A stone house? A broken fence? You," Urka said, her eyes boring into him. "You are the defense. This is your land. You know it's hollows. It's shadows, where a man can stand unseen." He looked at his fields, the familiar, gentle slope of the land down to the creek. He had never thought of it as a battlefield. He had only ever seen it as a place to grow things. Now he was being forced to see it through her eyes. Lines of sight, fields of fire, places of cover and concealment. They came that afternoon. 4 of them. They moved out of the woods not with stealth, but with an arrogant swagger, their heavy armor clanking. They were larger than Urka and her companions, bred for war, not leadership. They saw a small farm, a single human. They expected an easy kill. "The barn," Elian said, his voice quiet, urgent. "The loft." Zora nodded, a feral grin on her face, and slipped away. "Gara, the stone wall by the creek. They will have to cross the water. They will be slow there." Gara gave a curt nod and vanished. That left him and Urka. She looked at him, an unspoken question in her eyes. "They will come for the house," he said. "They will assume you are cornered in here." He handed her his wood axe. It was heavy but balanced. "The door is oak. It will hold for a moment. Long enough. And you." He picked up his pitchfork. It felt flimsy, ridiculous. "Lady," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching, "if I had tricks, I wouldn't live like this." He led her not to the front of the house, but to the small, shuttered window at the back, overlooking the goat pen. "They will split up. 2 for the front, 2 to circle around. They always do." It was a desperate gamble, based on a half-remembered training exercise from his days as a guard. But it was all he had. They waited in silence, the air thick with anticipation. He could hear the heavy tread of their boots, the low murmur of their voices as they approached the front of the house. Then a loud crash as one of them kicked the door. As he predicted, 2 of the warriors rounded the corner of the house. They were laughing, confident. They saw him, a lone farmer with a pitchfork, and their laughter grew. It died when Urka erupted from the shadows beside him. Even injured, she moved like a storm. The wood axe was a blur of motion. The first orc went down with a choked cry, his helmet cleft. The second managed to get his sword up, but Urka's attack was relentless. It was not the clean, practiced fighting of a duelist. It was a brutal, desperate, overwhelming assault. Metal rang on metal. From the barn loft, an arrow hissed through the air, taking one of the orcs at the front door in the throat. He gargled and fell. The last one, surprised, turned toward the barn. As he did, Gera rose from behind the stone wall and buried her knife in the back of his knee. He roared and stumbled into the creek. Gera was on him in an instant, a silent, grim shadow. It was over in less than a minute, for bodies lay cooling in the afternoon sun. Elias stood panting, the pitchfork held in a white-knuckled grip. His heart hammered against his ribs. Urka leaned against the wall of the house, breathing heavily, her hand pressed to her freshly stitched side. Zora and Gera emerged, their faces grim. They began methodically stripping the bodies of weapons and anything useful. There was no triumph in their actions, only a weary efficiency. This was not a victory. It was a message. They had killed the scouts. The main force would come now, and they would come with fire and wrath. They dragged the bodies into the woods. As they did, Gera pulled a small, water-skin pouch from the belt of the largest orc. She brought it to Urka. Urka opened it. She didn't look inside. She smelled it. Her face went rigid. She held it out for Elias to see. Inside was a finely wrought silver pin, the emblem of a snarling wolf's head. "Do you know this mark?" Urka's voice was dangerously quiet. Elias stared at it. His blood ran cold. He had seen it once, long ago, on a banner leading a war band that had razed a border town to the ground for a chest of gold. "Gorak," he whispered. "The wolf. A warlord. A butcher. He is my uncle," Urka said, her voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "And that pin belongs to my father, the chieftain." The full, crushing weight of it all fell on him. She wasn't just a fugitive. She was the daughter of a murdered chieftain, a princess in exile, and he, a failed town guard hiding on a remote farm, had just put himself in the middle of her war. He felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp. "You lied to me," he said, his voice tight. "I told you what you needed to know," she countered, her eyes like chips of ice. "You brought a war to my door. You should have told me who you were." "And what would you have done, farmer?" she shot back, her voice cutting across the clearing like iron breaking. "Would you have helped the daughter of Thrag? Or would you have barred your door and hoped the wolf passed you by?" He had no answer, because he knew what he would have done. He would have been afraid. He would have sent her away. The knowledge was a bitter taste in his mouth. He felt like a fool, a pawn used in a game he couldn't comprehend. The quiet connection he thought had been forming, the shared meals, the blanket by the fire, it all felt like a lie now, a calculated manipulation to secure her safety. The feeling of betrayal was a physical pain in his chest. He turned away from her, his hands clenched into fists. He looked at his farm, his home, the place he had built to be safe, to be quiet, and he knew it was about to be destroyed. They did not have to wait long. At dusk, they saw the fires, dozens of them, springing up like malevolent stars at the edge of the Glimmerwood. An army. Gorak had not come to scout. He had come to annihilate. There was no escape. The farm was situated in a small valley. To run would be to be cut down in the open. The small stone house was their only fortress, their tomb. They worked frantically as darkness fell, barricading the door and the windows with furniture, using sacks of grain as arrow stops. Elias moved in a haze of grim resignation. His life was over. The one he had built here, anyway. All that was left was to decide how to end it. The attack began with a volley of flaming arrows. They thudded into the roof and the wooden shutters, casting a hellish, flickering light into the room. The smell of smoke began to fill the air. Then came the assault. Orcs, dozens of them, screaming war cries, crashed against the walls of the house like a tidal wave. Elias fought. He was not a warrior, but this was his home. He knew every loose floorboard, every creak of the stairs. He stabbed through gaps in the barricades with his pitchfork. He swung a heavy cast-iron pan like a club. He fought with the desperate, unthinking ferocity of a cornered animal. Beside him, the three orc women were a whirlwind of controlled violence. Urka, despite her wound, seemed to be everywhere at once, her borrowed axe rising and falling, her voice shouting commands in her harsh tongue. Zora fought with a joyful savagery, laughing as she met her enemies. Gera was a quiet, deadly anchor, her movements economical and brutally effective. The barn caught fire first, the dry wood and hay going up with a roar. The light of the blaze illuminated the whole valley, revealing the sheer number of Gorak's forces. They were hopelessly outnumbered. The door began to splinter under the repeated blows of a battering ram. It was in a brief, sudden lull, as Gorak's warriors pulled back to regroup, that the warlord's voice boomed across the field. "Urka, daughter of a weak fool, your games are over. Throw down your weapons, and I will grant you a quick death. Or do you prefer to burn in that human's hovel, hiding behind a farmer?" The mockery hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Elian looked at the splintering door, at the smoke filling the room. This was the end. But Urka was not looking at the door. She was looking at him. Her face was smudged with soot, her armor dented, a fresh cut bleeding on her forehead. In the fiery light, she looked like a goddess of war. She moved to the shattered remains of the front window, pushing aside the barricade. She stood in the opening, silhouetted against the fire inside. She was a perfect target. "Gorak!" she bellowed, and her voice, raw with fury and exhaustion, silenced the entire battlefield. "You are a betrayer, a craven who murders his own kin in the dark." Gorak laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Brave words from a rat in a trap. "I am no rat," Urka shouted. She turned, her gaze finding Elian in the smoky chaos of the room. Her eyes held his. "I am Urka, daughter of Thrag, rightful chieftain of the Dragon's Tooth clan, and I claim this man, Elian of the Glimmerwood, as my shield mate. My hearthkin, his home is my home, and his people are my people." The declaration was a thunderclap. It was a formal, binding oath in orc tradition. More than that, it was a political statement of utter defiance. To claim a human, a creature most orcs considered somewhere between livestock and vermin, as hearthkin was a radical, unthinkable act. It was a direct insult to Gorak and every tradition he claimed to uphold. Elian stared at her, stunned into silence. The sounds of the battle, the roar of the fire, all of it faded away. In that moment, there was only her, standing in the breach, publicly tying her fate to his. It wasn't a lie. It wasn't a manipulation. It was a choice made in the face of death. Gorak's laughter stopped. He howled in rage. "Then you will die with him." The assault resumed with renewed fury. But something had changed in Elian. The resignation was gone, burned away by the fire of her words. He was no longer just a farmer defending his land. He was a shield mate, hearthkin. He had been given a title, a purpose, in the heart of the inferno that was consuming his life. He looked at the ruins of his quiet world, the smoke, the blood, the shattered remnants of his solitude. He had nothing left here, but he had her. He had a choice. He moved to stand beside her at the window, pitchfork in hand. Gorak's warriors were charging again. Urka glanced at him, her eyes questioning. "I accept," he said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "But I will not be your hearthkin. I will not be a thing you protect." He held up his calloused, dirt-stained hands. "I am a farmer. I will stand beside you, but I will stand as myself." A flicker of surprise crossed her face, quickly replaced by something else. A deep, unyielding respect, as solid as mountain stone. She gave a sharp, fierce nod. "Then stand." The end of his old life was the splintering of the door. The beginning of a new one was the roar of the enemy flooding in. They met the charge together, side by side, a chieftain's daughter and a simple farmer, against the world. They did not win. They could never have won, but they survived. Using the chaos of the collapsing, burning roof, they fought their way out the back of the house and into the night. It was a desperate flight, a brutal scramble through the woods, with Gorak's hunters baying at their heels. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, leaving behind the orange glow of the pyre that had once been Elian's home. They left his old life to burn to ashes. They found Urka's loyalists 2 days later, a small, grim band of about 30 warriors hidden in a cave system deep in the mountains. They were haggard, undersupplied, but their loyalty to Urka was absolute. To them, Elian was an anomaly, a human. They looked at his soft skin, his lack of tusks, his farmer's build, and their eyes were filled with suspicion and contempt. He was an outsider, a weakness in their midst. They did not understand their leader's declaration. He did not try to explain. He did not try to pick up a sword and prove his worth in their sparring pits. He knew he would fail, so he did what he knew how to do. He worked. He saw that their water supply was fouling their camp, so he dug a new channel to divert the waste. He saw their grain stores were riddled with damp and rot, so he built a raised, ventilated platform to keep it dry. He noticed their leather armor was cracking, so he showed them how to use animal fat and ash to treat it, a trick he'd used on his harnesses. He sharpened their blades not with a warrior's flourish, but with the patient, steady hand of a craftsman. He worked from before the sun touched the mountain peaks until long after it was gone. He spoke little, asked for nothing, and met their suspicious glares with a quiet, steady gaze. Slowly, begrudgingly, things began to change. They started coming to him with tools that needed mending. They began to ask his opinion on how best to fortify a defensive position. They stopped calling him human and started calling him alien. He was not one of them, but he was no longer an outsider. He was a part of their survival. Months passed. The small band grew as other loyalists, hearing that Urka lived, trickled in. They became a small, potent army, staging swift, sharp raids on Gorak's supply lines. Elias never fought in the raids. He prepared them. He made sure their weapons were sharp, their armor was sound, and their bellies were as full as they could be. His contribution was not in the bloodletting, but in the 100 small tasks that made the bloodletting possible. One evening, Urka was preparing to lead a critical raid on one of Gorak's forward camps. She was fastening her chest plate, her brow furrowed in concentration. Elias approached her, holding a newly braided leather strap. One of the straps on her armor was frayed, worn thin from use. He had noticed it that morning. Without a word, he knelt before her. He deftly unbuckled the old strap and replaced it with a new one he had made. His fingers were quick and sure. The action was intimate, familiar. It was the same practical, focused care he had shown when he first stitched her wound in his farmhouse so long ago. But the tension, the suspicion was gone. It was replaced by a quiet, comfortable trust. When he was done, he looked up at her. She was watching him, her face unreadable in the torchlight. Then, for the first time since he had met her, he saw her smile. It was not the baring of teeth that was an orc's grin. It was a small, almost hesitant curve of her lips, a softening of her hard features that changed her entire face. "The farmer's hands are strong," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. He just nodded, his own small smile answering hers. He rose to his feet. He had lost his home, his peace, his solitude. But he had found something he had not realized he was missing. He was no longer a man defined by his failure, hiding from the world. He had a place. He had a purpose. He was standing beside a queen, and he was seen not as a subject, but as an equal. His new life would be harder and far more dangerous than his old one, but he would not face it alone. And that, he realized, was what home truly was. It was not a place of stone and wood, but a person you chose to stand with against any storm.